Why would anyone want to program a computer to play an old board game?
Here, white has two choices, A and B.
You chose A.
It wasn't because A was better than B. It was more of the choice of style, I guess. So I thought the A or B, either one would be okay. And then when I was playing this game, I just somehow felt like playing A.
This emerging notion that many of our conscious decisions are really not conscious. Maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Well, there's some experimental evidence by now that when you undertake a voluntary action, like say picking this up, very briefly before you are conscious of making the decision, the parts of your brain that are organizing the action are already active, which means that the decision is made pre-consciously and then reaches consciousness at some point. Most of our decisions never reach consciousness. We're doing all kinds of things all the time and totally unaware of them. Well, first of all, I should be a little cautious about AI. What exactly is it? There's two variants of AI. One is roughly, science and engineering. I mean, it's a rough distinction. There's the kind of AI which is trying to construct devices that are useful. Self-driving cars, robots that can clean your house, things like that. That's fine. It's not really contributing, except very indirectly, to the understanding of how cognitive systems, intelligent systems work. It's doing things that are useful, which is fine. It's like building a bigger bulldozer. It's great. There's another kind of AI which is pure science, which is trying to discover the nature of what is going on when a nematode decides to turn to the left, or when I decide to pick this up. But that's the same as, it might be called AI if you like, but it's the same as just science, cognitive science. What will happen if I think the question is asking, what if robots are designed which have the same properties, the mechanisms that we will come to understand are essential for consciousness? Will they be conscious? We can already ask that question about dogs. I mean, are they conscious? In fact, you can ask that question about me. You know you're conscious. Do you know that I'm conscious? No, just because I tell you I am. That doesn't mean anything. The robot could too.
Why would anyone want to program a computer to play an old board game?
Good evening, everyone. Oops, I forgot my accent. Hello, good evening, everyone. Such fun.
And I would love to be able to talk about the future, but that hasn't happened yet. So what I'll do is mostly talk about how it evolved, how the attempts to make computers act intelligently developed in the early days up to the present, and see if that will give us a flying start to predicting what will happen later. But of course the future lies ahead, and we can't see exactly where it'll go, but we can make a few speculations. We'll need smart robots, and smart robots will need to be able to understand problems as well as workers do today. And today, none of our machines are very smart or perceptive or intelligent. In fact, I've been disappointed that, as we'll see shortly, there hasn't been much progress toward making machines smarter since the 1970s or so, when progress appeared to be very rapid.
Why would anyone want to program a computer to play an old board game? For people like Arthur Samuel. The attraction is the kudos of fathering an electronic alter ego that has a chance of achieving fame and glory by becoming the alpha male of gladiatorial combat. The same motivation that led IBM to invest quite a lot of its advertising budget to beat Garry Kasparov. Samuel's checkers playing program implemented Johnny von Neumann's Minimax theorem, adding to it a useful device, since called alpha-beta pruning, that reduced the size of the search space without losing information in the process. Samuel continued work on his program for many years, but gave up on it once other people's programs started beating it. No empire lasts forever. Ironically, most striking advance in board game playing performance has been achieved by throwing almost all the information away. Relying purely on Stanislav Ulam's observation that subatomic particles are like sheep, they are all the same, so it's good enough to just look at a few of them. And Bernd Brugmann realized it would work just as well for the drop of the stone because ripples spread outwards even if they bump into each other because there's more than one of them. And it works for one other significant reason, namely the inability of the human mind to see around the corner of tomorrow. As is manifest by the recalcitrance of consumer societies the world over to change their carbon dioxide thermal blanket-producing behavior, which is almost certain to bugger up things for their grandchildren. The banks of Monte Carlo and Las Vegas bust open their punters' wallets not just because the roulette dice are loaded in favor of the casinos, but because, like stock market bulls, eye rollers naively assume that just because things have gone all right up to now, they will continue to do so, and only stop after it's already too late. It is this short-sighted, simple-minded frailty of aged not very sapiens that enabled Goldfinger and his mates from Jekyll Island to hoover up pensioners' savings 7 years after robbing workers of livelihoods and collateral damage citizens of their lives by false flags like those currently being waved over the oil fields of Iraq. A bush in the drone bird is worth two in the black hand. In October 2015, Japan conquered Germany when a Japanese box of Monte Carlo tricks called Zen knocked the German champ off his perch with a Romanesque triumphant flourish at the very end. Ta-da! Julien Offray de la Mettrie must be dancing with delight over the grave of Bishop Wilberforce for finally having been proven right, long after he, like so many before and after him, had been murdered by the eminences of the Church for daring to doubt their authority. Zen is actually 4 boxes of tricks tied up with 1 gigabit Ethernet string.
Google has a translator, which is kind of useful if you want to get the rough idea of what's in, say, some scientific article. It's in, some language you don't know. It's kind of helpful. But it's done by brute force. It doesn't give any insight into the nature of translation.
ZUZESAMCTSAMAF SO-called large patterns trained with 50K game record using Remis method and smart heavy MC simulations Mogo style. The improvement with root parallelization on a cluster of 4 computers is about 1.522 rank. Shield 3.10 EL. The network is commonly used GB. Not expensive 10 GB commonly used for supercomputers.
whereas its victim Franz Joseph only had 2 billion neurons to work with. The face of AI need not be as ugly as Schwarzenegger's, it could be as cute as Neo's. Because Neo has ESP, it can Wi-Fi son of Zen, and like Obama, just do as it is told. Computer Go or Computer Any Old Board Game is a convenient experimental testbed for scientific inquiry into the computational nature of intelligence. It is convenient because it is a narrowly scoped information domain, one free from the foggy hairiness of the physical world, which thereby enables its investigator to toy around with experimental models of knowledge representation and processing without becoming bogged down by also having to distinguish signal from noise, a significant hurdle that real-world robots have to confront.
The program that you put into a device that's sitting on your desk, the device itself is of no use for anything other than maybe holding down papers. It's a paperweight, but it can execute the program. Now, what's a program? A program is a theory. It's a theory written in an arcane, complex notation designed to be executed by the machine. But about the program, you ask the same questions you ask about any other theory. Does it give insight and understanding?
Jack Tratt thinks that from a rational point of view, perfection is an impractical utopian flight of fancy. AI could do worse than borrow ideas that biological evolution has worked out and make reasoned guesses rather than throw Buffon's needles all over the place hoping that the pie of treasure is uniformly distributed in information space. Hofstadter and Minsky both say the same thing.
Anyway, one thing we learned in the early days of modern computers was that if you can't solve a problem one way, then a good thing to do is to have several ways to solve it so that you're less likely to get stuck. And if you look at the human nervous system, you see that humans are very good at that sort of resourcefulness. This slide shows a dozen different ways to recognize objects and to visually estimate where they're located with respect to you. A smart person can see anything in several ways and juggle the different meanings. We still have yet to do that with our computer programs, but I expect that that will be the main line of progress of getting computers to seem smarter in the future. In other words, the common sense things that every normal person can do seems more difficult to capture in terms of procedures that computers could do than the highly specialized skills that our highly paid experts can do.
In my opinion, they use too much brute force in it. And
pure calculating power.
That's right. I would like to see contests that are more like the one design sailboat contests, where it's the cleverness that's involved rather than who can build a monster special purpose machine.
Of the various bots hanging around street corners on KGS, the one that intrigues me most is DC Inigo, which plays human-like moves in the early part of the game, although dramatically not so in the USA. I don't know the particulars of its innards, but published articles on deep convolutional neural networks say that they are multi-layered perceptrons which are successful at identifying specified objects in images, making them as handy a tool for image database search as Watson is for retrieving lexically matching factoids. Perceptrons were conceived by Rumelhard and Norman to simulate the information processing behavior of biological neurons. An individual neuron performs an information processing function like that of a transistor. Its feedback threshold weight adjustment algorithm being analogous to varying the gate potential of a transistor. Neuroscience has discovered, presumably through autopsy microscopic X-ray examination, that the neurons of newborn babies are more highly interconnected than those of adults. And it is thought that one mechanism of biological learning is the weakening and erasure of some synaptic connections, equivalent to letting perceptron weights diminish as well as increase, so that they do not add noise to the information being processed. I believe DCN-Go is taught by feeding it thousands of games as exemplars. This technique, called unsupervised learning because it is not told whether individual moves were good or bad, but just that they happened, is somewhat similar to the way a newborn baby learns. The most significant influence on baby learning is the feedback it receives from its environment, most especially from its mother by her reactions to what the baby does. All babies know how to cry different cries to mean different things. But as few mothers learn what the different cries mean, after a few months most babies stop bothering to make the sounds they were born with to use to try to communicate their needs and, except when in severe distress, just use body language instead. Until they have, a year or so later, learned to make sounds that their mother can recognize. Until they have learned to speak their mother tongue.
Head, the doctor checks our reflexes to make sure that we're okay. And when sound is added to these reflexes, you get a particular sound, which we're calling a word. So babies all around the world have the same reflexes, and they therefore make the same sounds.
So all babies around the world, regardless of what race or nationality they are, speak the same language.
They do.
It's baby language.
Yeah, they have.
I've always thought that. So researchers at Brown University have been studying a baby's cry for a lot of years now, but Priscilla then met with them, these researchers at Brown, and says she introduced them to a whole new idea. What was that? They were listening to the cry.
Yeah.
And you said?
Well, they came out to Australia to check out my research, and I found out that I was actually listening to the pre-cry part of the baby's whole cry.
Pre-cry.
Yeah, so they listen to the, I guess the hysterical part of the cry, and they've been listening to the whole cry, whereas I've been listening to the pre-cry sound, and I've been pulling elements out of the whole cry rather than listening to the whole cry.
So Priscilla says that all newborn babies communicate by using 5 universal sounds, and all babies all over the world use the same sounds. The words sound very similar when you first hear them, but Priscilla says that after listening to them a few times, that you, as a mother, can learn to quickly identify each one and understand what your baby is saying to you. So in a few moments, you're going to see what happened when we put Priscilla in a room with 8 new mothers and their babies to test her baby language theory. First, take us through those 5 sounds, which are?
Okay, the first word is ne.
Ne.
And this is the word for hunger.
Ne.
Yeah. And the way that...
Ne. I've heard babies do that. No.
Yeah, you have. And how it works is the baby has a sucking reflex, so it gets hungry, starts to suck, and then when it starts to cry, it produces a neh sound. And if you make it yourself, you run the tongue along the top of your mouth, pretend you've got no teeth. Yeah. We can all do it. You've got neh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one. So that means I'm hungry.
That's right.
And if you don't respond soon enough, it goes into the hysterical cry.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like they're talking to you. So they'll say, I'm hungry, and they'll say it really nicely. And then if they're not responded to, they'll start getting a bit cross, and they'll go, I'm really hungry. And then,
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so Priscilla taped hundreds of babies making the neh sound. And here are just a few of them. Take a look. Okay, so that's ne for hungry. I'm hungry. What's the next word?
The next word is ow, and that's a word for sleeping, and this is based on a yawn reflex. So if you yawn, you go, oh. So, and you'll get an oval-shaped mouth.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh.
Oh. Okay, here are some examples of what Priscilla says, oh, sounds like with babies. Very good. Now, you've uncovered a word that you say means discomfort. What is that?
Yes, this is the word he, and you're listening for the H part of this sound.
Because he and ne are very similar.
They are. They both have the S sound, but you're listening, with ne, you're listening for the n part, and with he, you're listening for the he, the H part.
I guess that DCN Ego learns from environmental feedback by being told who won at the end of each game it is shown. So it can backpropagate that through its network to adjust weights so as to favor or disfavor move choices in particular positions. The sensory world of a baby, and the world of pixelated images, whether stills or video frames, have a lot in common. There is more noise than signal, and the main thing they have to do is distinguish one from the other. But the world of Go, with just 361 pixels of only 3 colors, is markedly different from the 3 + 5 and a few more dimensional sensory world of a baby, because every change in a single pixel has a dramatic long-term effect, even if it's not Kakashi. So I think that what DCN Ego is really learning is not abstractions of position structures and generalized moves, but a perceptron encoded rote memory of individual positions and individual moves. It could have done that more quickly with a simple Zobrist hash index database. If I've got this wrong, maybe someone can correct me by writing a comment.
This is very important because your work seems to be saying, that in natural human life, we use a lot of mental shortcuts. We don't solve problems by using brute intellectual force. We somehow have rules of thumb that guide us, and you're attempting to develop formalized logic that would enable machines to be able to sort of work in that fashion.
Yes, that's right, and indeed the collection of problems on which computer brute force can be applied is rather limited. Most of the problems of common sense reasoning are problems where there really isn't that much opportunity to apply brute force, or at least nobody's really figured out how to do so. Mm-hmm. And I would say the central problem of artificial intelligence involves how to express the knowledge about the world that is necessary for intelligent behavior. And I've pursued mathematical logic as the tool. This has had its ups and downs in popularity. In the late 1970s, several people independently, myself among them, discovered ways of formalizing what we call non-monotonic reasoning, which greatly extended the power of mathematical logic in the common sense area.
Now, I know many of our viewers are going to have difficulty with a term like non-monotonic reasoning, and yet it may be crucial to our understanding of some of the developments that await us in the future. So could you expand on that?
Okay. So you have to say what it's non.
Mm-hmm.
And ordinary logic has the property that if you can draw a certain conclusion from some premises, then if you add more premises, you can still draw that conclusion. So the set of conclusions that you can draw only increase when you increase the set of premises. They don't decrease. Now, human reasoning and what we will have to make computers do doesn't always have that property.
And could you give an example?
Yeah. Suppose we have I tell you that I have a bird that I want you to build me a bird cage for. Then, and that's all I tell you. Then you would draw the conclusion that my bird can fly and that you'd better put a top on the bird cage. On the other hand, if you learn the additional fact that my bird is a penguin, then you would feel that you do not need to put a top on it. So the conclusion that the birdcage required a top depends non-monotonically on the facts that I tell you.
In other words, this is an example of non-monotonic logic, and it has sort of built-in assumptions that I work with. That is, when you use the word bird, I assume it can fly.
That's right. That's the kind of, and that's the sort of convention of English or of other natural languages. If I hire you to build me a bird cage and you build it without a top, and I refuse to pay, and you tell the judge, he never said his bird can fly, the judge will side with me. On the other hand, if you did build it with a top, and I say, well, my bird is a penguin, he wasted material, the judge will side with you, because it's a convention of English that if a bird can fly, it doesn't have to be mentioned, even if it's important. Whereas if a bird cannot fly, then it must be mentioned if it's relevant. Well, that's non-monotonicity is only part of the context problem. Now that we can formalize some non-monotonic reasoning, we see that, well, there's a good deal more to context than that, and it's, so to speak, the next mountain that has to be surmounted. Suppose you want to be able to reason about birds flying, and then you might say, well, I'll put in the exceptions, ostriches and penguins and so forth. And then someone comes along and says, well, what about a bird with his feet encased in cement? And then you can see that, well, you couldn't possibly put in all the exceptions, because if you put that one in, I'll invent another exotic exception that you wouldn't put in. So what you have to do instead is go to a system where you will assume that the bird can fly unless you have some evidence to the contrary.
Now this seems, I have to tell you, it seems very simple to me. Yet you're describing this as somehow something new in the world of computers.
Well, that's right. And what I believe is that if it takes 200 years to achieve artificial intelligence, and then finally there is a textbook that explains how it's done, the hardest part of that textbook to write will be the part that explains why people didn't think of it 200 years ago. Because we're really talking about how to make machines do things that are really on the surface of our minds. It's just that our ability to observe our own mental processes is not very good and has not been very good. And we can look at that historically. When we look at Leibniz, who was an extremely smart scientist, he was the co-inventor of calculus with Isaac Newton. He wanted to make a logical calculus that would permit calculation instead of argument. And he invented binary numbers in this case, but he didn't even invent propositional calculus. That was invented by Boole 150 years later. And then Boole didn't invent predicate calculus. So what one sees is that each step in understanding of thought processes has taken time. Well, as I say, I think there are conceptual breakthroughs that have to be made. And the extreme is that, well, some smart young fellow has just done it. He just hasn't told us yet. And the other extreme is that it may take a couple hundred years, maybe 500 even, depending on how many conceptual problems there are. That is, it might take 500 years before we have computer programs that are as intelligent as human beings.
So what's your take, generally speaking, about Ray's technological singularity?
It's science fiction. I don't see any particular reason to believe it.
So ultimately, the project that you and your colleagues in the field of artificial intelligence are engaged in, one might view it as the most noble project of all, the one that Socrates actually urged people into, which is to know thyself, and sometimes against great odds to attempt to do what may be, in effect, one of the most difficult tasks facing humankind.
Well, it's certainly a difficult task.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us.
Largely. Anyway, it's pretty clear that however the brain works, it's composed of different levels of processing, and however the mind works, we can think of it as a collection of different resources. If you look at the brain, everyone knows that different areas of the brain seem to do different things. We know very little about how they're done, but we know that here's an area for speech and here's an area for vision, strangely at the back of the head, as far from the eyes as you can get. And here's high-level thinking and so on and so forth. And many different areas of the brain have been identified roughly with different aspects of thought. And however those things work, it suggests that we can think of, it's profitable to think of the brain as lots of different specialists. And so you can make simple theories, and this slide shows a theory of emotions, which suggests that when you're angry, a certain collection of brain centers are active and many others aren't. When you're hungry, another set, and when you're afraid or when you're thirsty, yet other groups of cells are being operated, but they're not all separate. Some of them are common to many different emotional states. And the same thing is probably true of higher level thinking. Like if you have a problem and you're stuck, what should you do? And this diagram suggests 4 things you can do. Can you split the problem into several parts and work on them separately? That's a way to make progress. Can you make an analogy? Can you think of another problem just like that? So in any case, either for emotional things or for intellectual things, each mental state you can think of as activating some particular set of mental resources to various degrees. And each fragment of knowledge might work in some situations and not others. I'll just mention a few early projects that I think are right now buried in the past and could deserve being revived and extended in the next few years. Pat Winston wrote a brilliant thesis, I think in 1972, about thinking as being based on finding differences between things and modifying those differences. So that was an outcome of early cybernetics, a beautiful subject of the 1940s. Another model that grew up in psychoanalysis was the idea that the mind is full of critics, which are watching parts of the brain or parts of the mind are constantly censoring or criticizing or praising and selecting activities, making lists of them or networks of them, and as you proceed from one state of mind to another, you rearrange your resources and get better and better, if you're lucky, at dealing with the kinds of problems you're facing at the moment.
And over the years, then, I devoted a great deal of my life to thinking about what cognition is, and I guess tonight I'm going to be telling you some of the important conclusions that I've come to, and I don't know if I can convince anybody, but I will do my best. I will begin with a sort of a complaint, and everything is in focus. Good, that's great. By the way, I don't use PowerPoint, for better or for worse. I don't know what that means, but so you'll have to put up with my handwriting and with sloppiness and things like that. And so in cognitive science, the cognitive science conferences and journals and so forth, they divide cognition up into all sorts of different pieces. And one of the pieces is always called analogical reasoning. And it's usually put together with problem solving. And it's sort of one little teeny part of thinking. And I sort of decided that I would put it this way, that analogical reasoning, they sort of is the Delaware of cognition. So I kind of feel that shunts it off a little bit. It doesn't make it very central. Now, you might think that Indiana would be a better name for analogical reasoning, but I'm going to be a little bit more daring than that. And it doesn't mean California either, or Texas, or Alaska. First of all, we're going to get rid of the word reasoning. I don't want reasoning. Analogy has nothing to do with reasoning, or it does a little bit, but not much. I mean, it's just a misnomer, and it's a misconception of what analogy is. And that's what I really want you to understand, and I suppose that's sort of the bottom line of this talk. If we are going to make any connection between analogy and a geographical situation, we're going to liken it to the interstate freeway system, and it links everything together. Analogy is the interstate freeway system of cognition. It is not one little tiny zone somewhere off in the side. So that's a kind of a way of that I think about it. I mean, I don't really usually think about it that way. I made that up yesterday, so but it gives you the flavor. So one of my rules, which I'm sure I will disobey tonight, is don't cover your transparencies. Let everybody see everything. But I may not do that. We'll see if I'm true to my own principles. So, as it says here, I think of categorization. I mean, the story about analogy making, of course, has to be a little bit more than just analogy making. So I want to sort of show you how things fit together. Categorization is the name of the cognition game, but analogy is the mechanism that creates or allows categorization to happen. By categorization, I mean deciding what something is, what the essence of something is. So now, one could sort of summarize this in a corny little analogy. Again, analogy is the motor of the car of thought, and then we can even write it down as this little thing. Analogy is to thinking as a motor is to a car, A is to B as C is to D, and this sort of reduces it down to the old standard, A is to B, C is to D. Proportional analogy looks like a fraction, and that's very nice, and it's the kind of thing, like shoe is to foot as glove is to hand, and these kinds of things that maybe they put on IQ tests and SATs and things like that. But that's not how I think of analogy either. I mean, that's again putting it into a little tiny box and saying that all of analogy is A is to B as C is to D, and it misses the point. So I don't know. I can't define anything, and I kind of hate definitions, but I will at least sort of give you a sense. Analogy making is the perception of common essence between two things, and then a couple of footnotes to sort of hedge. I mean, things don't have essences, but what I mean, I'm not talking about some kind of abstract, glowing philosophical essence. I'm talking about the essence that you perceive at the particular time in the frame of mind that you happen to be in. And when I say things, it's tempting to think that the analogies are between the things in the external world, but I really want to say that analogies happen inside your head, so that they're connections between two mental representations. They're connections between things inside your head, which we project to the outside world. And we say these things out there are analogous, and that's very reasonable to do. But I wanted to emphasize how they go on inside the head, and they are between mental representations. Now, I want to give you a couple of analogies, some of my favorite analogies. They're all... analogies I could give you forever, but I'm going to give you a few that I think are very interesting and kind of provocative. So I'll begin with when I was a kid. I was 8 years old, as I recall, when I found out about exponents. And I was in love with math, and I was fascinated with any new mathematical concept, and I made tables of integers to various powers. I filled notebooks with these kinds of things. So one day I was walking through the house, and I saw a paper that my dad was reading, and he was a physicist, and it had math notation galore, and I couldn't make head or tail of it, but what I did notice was that there was there are little things that said, you know, like x sub 1, x sub 2, and stuff like that. And I thought, ooh, look at that, these little subscripts. So here's my little transparency. The red, you can get the idea that I saw that my guess was, what in the world, what operation on numbers does this subscripting thing do? If the superscripting thing, you know, puts it to a power, what does the subscripting do? I was really interested. And my dad told me, he said, oh, that doesn't do anything. It's just the way of naming variables. And I was so disappointed, completely flattened. Okay. Fast forward 40 years. Fast forward 40 years. Now I'm a father of a 1-year-old daughter named Monica, and Monica is sitting in our playroom pushing the button of the dust buster. Having time of her life. And then, what does she see? She sees another button. And she pushes it and nothing happens. And I'm watching her. And I go over there, I'm sitting, you know, on the floor, and I get up and I go over next to Monica, and I push the button and I open it up and I show her, this is just where the garbage is, you know. And Monica's, of course, completely destroyed. And at that moment, you have to understand, I hadn't thought about this thing with my dad for probably 40 years. At that moment, the whole thing of the exponents and the subscripts comes rushing to my head. And I just want to, you know, kind of spell out this analogy. It's a pretty complicated one. I mean, somebody said to me, I guess it was Don today, he said, oh, people make the mistake of reading out loud their transparencies. So I don't know. I don't know if I can avoid reading this out loud, though, because it's kind of fun. But I've already told it to you, so maybe I won't. I mean, I think it's interesting, though, that if you, I mean, you know, here is me and all my love of mathematics and the subscripts. And this is an interesting line here because I make an analogy. Part of this analogy is an analogy. I make an analogy between superscripts and subscripts. And I think, there's something there. And then I get flattened by my father. Okay. And so here's Monica, and she comes along and she makes an analogy between one button and another. And she's hoping, and then she gets flattened by her father, who happens to be me, but that's just a coincidence. But anyway, there you go. I mean, it's a pretty complicated analogy. The next one, that one is what you might call a reminding event. And a lot of analogies are reminding events. And I want to say something immediately, which is that a lot of people think analogies are there to serve purposes. They're not there to serve purposes at all. They just happen. That's all. There's no purpose. There's no purpose at all. They just happen. Sure, they're in a certain sense, they're serving evolution, but that's about the only purpose that there is, you think. I want to give you an analogy that occurred to me a few months ago. I was reading a book that my mother had loaned me by Jonathan Raban called, I don't remember exactly, something about Voyage to America or Discovering America or something. I mean, he's traveling across, his first chapter, he's traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. I was in an airplane. I was flying back from California to Indiana, and we were flying on our first leg. We were going to Denver. And which is perhaps a United hub, I don't know. Anyway, we were going to Denver, and so I was reading this first chapter in which Jonathan Raban goes from England, from Liverpool to somewhere in Canada, and he was in a boat called the Atlantic Conveyor, and he was very impressed by the size of this boat and thought that surely nothing could rock it, but the captain told him, no, the boat is very vulnerable. And then what do you know, but they discovered a hurricane that was, in their pathway, or it was actually coming up the Atlantic, and it was going to be right in their way. And so, well, I mean, not very complicated thinking, but here's what they did. There's the Atlantic conveyor, and there's Hurricane Helene, and I've drawn this a little bit off because I don't know if they went quite that far south, but I didn't want to put in time and everything. You get the basic idea here. I mean, the hurricane went up, and they went to the south, they deviated a little bit, and missed it, and then went up, and then turned back up. Okay, so I've just read this thing. Well, I'm thinking about the Atlantic Ocean and this big hurricane, which was, curiously enough, called a whirly girl by the captain. And I'm thinking about this, but I mean, it's just part of the first chapter. It's not a major part of the first chapter. It's just something that happens. The first chapter is all about this trip across the Atlantic, and so forth and so on. And then I get out at Denver, and I'm walking down the corridor, and as one does in airports, and here's a picture of me, and this is a woman with a suitcase, and she's crossing the corridor, and I swerved a little bit to the left, and all of a sudden, bang! I thought, hey, I'm the boat, she's the hurricane, or if you wish, the whirly girl, and this corridor is the Atlantic Ocean. And 2 seconds is 2 days, or whatever it may be. And now, I have to explain to you also, this event inside my head happened so quickly and so fleetingly that I would not have even noticed it if I weren't kind of an inveterate observer of my own thinking. I mean, I caught it, it would have disappeared in a flash, and to leave no effect on the world at all. But here it is, leaving an effect on all of you now. My point is, analogies happen all the time for no purpose. They're fleeting, they're transient, they just appear and go away. Okay? Your mind is filled with them. Now, to get, the poster that was made used these two photographs, which were taken at my parents' ranch back in the 80s, I believe. Now, various people may have thought various things about them, and I'm just going to tell you what is here. The upper one is in the summer, and there's this lovely oak tree that I know very, very well, casting its shadow under the noonday sun, more or less. The lower one is in the winter, and there is no sun at all. It's a cloudy day. What is that pattern, that dark thing under? That is a snow shadow, if you wish. That is the absence of snow. The snow has fallen, but it didn't go through the tree. It got caught by the tree, and so no snow is on the ground, and that dark patch is the absence of snow. And it's a kind of a generalization of a shadow. To me, it was just a sort of a trivial connection, but it joined in many other kinds of shadows that I've thought about over the course of my life. I mean, I know that in eastern Oregon and maybe other places there is what they call a rain shadow, which is to the east of the Cascade Mountains for some 100 or 200 or some miles. There's a desert. In other words, the Cascade Mountains basically stop the clouds from moving, and so there's no rain to the east of the Cascades, and that's called a rain shadow. And there are all sorts of other kinds of shadows that I'm not going to go into. Shadow is a very common metaphor, people being in the shadow of their parents, or in the shadow of World War II, and so forth and so on. But I want to just make a curious little analogy that may be a new insight into the world, which is that, firstly, this idea that we're expanding the word shadow. We're expanding the word shadow. That in itself is part of what I wanted to tell you, that by seeing new instances of shadow, we're expanding our sense of what the word shadow means. This happens to be maybe my personal sense as opposed to a public sense, but it's no less valid. But I wanted to say that we could look at the picture of snow and maybe deduce something about light. We know that snow is made out of flakes, and we might just guess that because there's an analogy between light and snow, maybe light is made out of flakes. It's kind of a crazy idea, but we'll call it the light flake hypothesis. I suppose it is a fairly light and flaky hypothesis. But Hofstadter, 2005. Maybe we'll come back to that. Another shadow. This is one of my favorites, and we'll stop shadows at that point. I was talking with a friend who's Italian, and his brother is a professor at some university in northern Norway, and I said, "Oh my God, it must be awfully cold up there." And he said, "No, actually it's pretty warm." And I said, "How can that be?" And he said, "Well, you know, the Gulf Stream is warm." And I said, "Yeah, but you know, it's very far north." He said, "Yeah, but it goes north." And I said, "But he says that the interesting thing is that where it's cold is southern Norway." And I said, "How is that?" He said, "Because the Gulf Stream is blocked by England." And so I had this picture in my mind. I don't know if you can see the Gulf Stream, which is supposed to be red here, and it gets blocked by England. And so the shadow of England is on the coast of southern Norway, and the Gulf Stream hits the upper part of Norway. So we have a shadow thrown by England of the Gulf Stream. So it's, again, a wonderful abstraction of shadow. This is the kind of thing that analogy does to our concepts. Now, so here is just, you know, this simple idea that repeated analogies expand concepts. I've taken as the concept of number here, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail. I just simply want to say that anybody who's done any math knows that we begin with the positive integers. We learn to count. Then we learn about things like a half and a quarter and so forth. And eventually we learn about 0 and the negative numbers. And then after many, and all of these are analogies. These are all generalizations that are made through analogy. And as we progress and go further and further, we get more and more abstract. And so I've indicated some things here: e and pi and e to the I pi and aleph sub omega, different kinds of infinities. And I could include matrices in there and on and on. And so we have all sorts of numbers, and they could keep on going. Concepts expand over our lifetime, and they expand for each one of us, and they expand for our culture. One of the key points that I want to make here, though, is that although concepts expand by seeing new instances, sometimes we have a concept that has only got one instance. But even there, it starts to spread and leak. So let's talk about that a little bit. The basic idea here is there is no fundamental difference between a single memory trace and a category, by which I mean a concept, no difference, category, concept, same thing. Okay, that's a very important idea of this talk, and I'm just going to give you a thing I call pluralization. So I'll read these out loud because I think that they're amusing. So there may be 2 or 3 young Einsteins among us tonight. Okay, what is a young Einstein? That's a pluralization of Einstein. Clearly, Milton Babbitt is no Mozart, if you happen to know who Milton Babbitt is. If another Chopin was born in Lompoc, what would happen? It's the next Catcher in the Rye, or the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the Paris of the Middle East, which was once the name of Beirut. Some place can be, actually I once heard Jerusalem being described as a Mecca for tourists. A bunch of treacherous quislings. Notice I've gone to the lowercase here. Mecca with lowercase, even though it comes from originally one thing, it gets pluralized. And Quisling was a Norwegian foreign minister or prime minister or something who I think collaborated with the Nazis. I don't remember the details. But it became a lowercase word for basically a traitor. And then Galileo, I don't know the details of this, but I have to assume that it was Galileo who actually used the word luna in the plural and with a lowercase m. In other words, talking about what he saw, he equated our moon with those things, those dots that he saw through his telescope, and called those moons. That was a magnificent leap that pluralized something that nobody had ever considered to be other than one unique thing in the world. So pluralization is a way in which a single entity becomes a wide category. And there really is no difference between a single entity and a category. Okay. So I guess I'm just saying this again. There's no fundamental difference between seeing something as a category member and seeing something as analogous to something else. In one case, something evokes a concept which has one instance, and in another case, something evokes a concept which has many instances and which has blurred together. Now, we come to another very special thing about human minds. Our minds are constructed, this is not new to anybody, with an unlimited quality for chunking. By that, what I mean is that primordial concepts in some interrelationship become a larger unit, a larger conceptual unit, like a family or something like that, and then a family can get incorporated into something larger, and we build our concepts by taking several concepts, putting them together, putting a membrane around them, and then sort of miraculously the internal components sort of disappear, and we're left with just this new concept, which is kind of like a black box. We don't think it so much about these things become semi-visible. They're sort of lurking in the background. But if it's structured at many levels of hierarchy, the concepts inside the concepts are certainly just about invisible, and it really takes some unpacking to get there. So as we build up concepts, they get hierarchically larger and larger and larger and more complex. And I wanted to just give you one example that I thought was really very interesting. And I haven't even scratched the surface of this one, but take a look at it anyway. Take a look at this. This is the notion of a hub for an airlines. I mean, it's just an attempt to show you how we begin with concepts that we acquire when we're very, very young. And I've put here things like ball goes to roll, roll to wheel, wheel gives you spokes, and hub and gives you the notion of centrality. I'm not saying these arrows are not necessarily analogy arrows. These arrows sort of represent the idea that this thing is sort of part of that concept. It's sort of gotten incorporated, glommed into that concept. And not precisely, I don't have time to spell it out, but I want you to see this as a series of higher concepts that are glomming together lower ones. These are the lower ones at the top. Excuse for that reversal of directions. But anyway, so bike is a vehicle, a bike has wheels, a car is a vehicle, a bus is a vehicle, another type of vehicle is a plane, then a plane can lead you to an airliner, a bus is kind of like an airliner leads you to the more abstract notion of an airline. Then we have names, which we learn when we're very small. Names suggest that there are things that come in different types. Then we learn about brands. Then we learn about companies. And an airline is a particular type of company. Moving. And then we have the idea of a trip. And then a trip can be broken up into legs. And legs can be sort of formalized into routes. And that's attached to airline. It's also attached to a network. Time, appointment, timetable, chart, network, and then this abstract notion of network goes to node, and then we have to get. So that's something pretty primordial. Get. And then when we're very small, we also learn about buy. Please buy me. Money we learn about. And then later we learn about economizing and saving money. And then we learn about sort of downsizing and how companies have to downsize. By the way, notice I forgot the whole notion of city and the whole notion of airport. I didn't even put that here. I mean, just imagine all the concepts here that are all required to go into the concept of hub. And yet when we say, Denver is United Hub, do you think about all of this stuff? You don't think at all. I mean, you know this as a chunked concept. And so it's a very important part of how we think. So Another point is that there is no fundamental difference, though, between thinking with very, very basic concepts and thinking with these very large concepts, because the very large concepts become as familiar, and we don't see inside them. We don't deal with all the stuff that's inside them. So some of the primordial concepts are these, and some of the more sophisticated concepts are soap opera, hub, sleazeball, wilderness protection legislation, or scientific break-even for laser fusion. Complicated things, but if you're familiar with them, they're just very ordinary. They're as familiar as the back of your hand. I thought I'd illustrate some rather complex concepts, just for my amusement and yours, to show you how amazing our human conceptual system is. So indulge me with my reading this slide out loud. I'll go down vertically. So we have the solar system, the concept of a slam dunk, a beltway, plagiarism, jazzercise, laissez-faire economics, ethnic cleansing, the domino theory of communism, the next line, Bose condensation or Bose condensate, the Wikipedia. Now I want you to think to yourself, how many levels of structure to explain the Wikipedia would you have to, if you were to try to explain that to somebody from 2,000 years ago, what would you have to tell them in order to get across the idea of the Wikipedia? You have to explain computers and networks and the web and an encyclopedia and publishing and who knows what all. Okay, .com bubble, spam. It's hard enough to understand what a Republican and a Democrat are. That's a very complex concept. Gas war, the Final Four, Y2K, the genetic code, quantum cryptography, a baby boomer, chick flick, WASP, the Fed. I have no idea what the Fed is. I have no concept. Gravitino, I also have no concept of that. I know it's supposed to be some sort of supersymmetric partner to the graviton. Pork belly futures, that's a great one. Fishing with a PH. Radar trap, affirmative action, grocery store checkout stand, presidential lecture, and wacky walk. These are concepts that we deal with very easily, very fluently, and they are so far removed from the concept network that an ant might have, or that a mouse might have, or that a dog might have, or that a 4-year-old might have, or that even a 12-year-old might have. So you have to think how many levels there are. Now, we're talking about concepts at many, many levels. Primordial words, simple words, some compound words, phrases, proverbs. I'm going to come to this. I'm going to sort of illustrate these. And then a lot of our concepts are totally unlabeled. Like, for example, my concept, whatever it was, of what happened to me when my dad told me they don't do anything. They're just names of variables. That was stored in my brain, and it was waiting there to be triggered by some event in the future. What was the event? Monica on the floor with the dustbuster. That was a concept. It didn't have a name. There's no name for Doug being disillusioned by his father about subscripts not being analogous to superscripts in mathematics. That was a thing in my brain. It was a node. It was there in some sense, or I don't know if node is the right word, but it was there. It was retrievable under the right circumstances. It shared essence. I hope you will agree with me there. It shared essence with Monica's disillusionment. Now, so we have a lot of different kinds of things. I'm going to talk about these other things, Me Too's in particular, and scientific leaps. I want to go through this a little bit, talking about how analogy making retrieves one thing at each of these levels. I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to, name some primordial concepts. I won't read these out loud, but notice, by the way, in this list, that I am not favoring nouns. I want you to understand that when I talk about categories, I do not think that categories are always visual things like, overhead projector or shoe or, even audience. Categories can be things like, as I said, please, what that means is there are certain circumstances where that word is evoked. The circumstance evokes that mental concept. It's a please circumstance. There are certain circumstances, if I said please to you now, it wouldn't make any sense. Makes no sense at all. But if I'm a little 3-year-old and I want something and I say please, it makes sense. There are certain circumstances where it is appropriate. And I'm trying to point out here that words of all sorts, whether they're adverbs or prepositions or pronouns or verbs or nouns, they are all categories, and they're all equally good. And most of them are not visual. A lot of them are not sensory whatsoever. And theories of categorization mostly are involved with visual categories, visual objects. It's so mistaken. That is not where the action is. And one of my colleagues, who I respect very greatly, said that he thought that categorization at this kind of level is very, very straightforward. It's just a matter of feature detectors. And I think, oh my goodness, we are not from the same planet. I don't think categorization at that level is anything to do with feature detectors. Maybe they play a little role, but it's not, it's really, that's another thing, that's for tomorrow, that's not for today. Okay, simple concepts. Those are primordial. Here are some, they're getting a little more sophisticated. Chair, I remember there was an exhibit of chairs at the San Francisco International Airport some years ago. Wonderful exhibit of crazy chairs. And then I got books of chairs. You can buy books of thousands of different kinds of chairs. And the variety is mind-boggling. The same for the letter A. And tell me the features of a mess. If we're talking about visual categories, what are the features of a mess? I would like to know which neurons, which feature detectors in my brain fire when I see a mess. What about the feature detectors for the word probably, or for probably situations? And how about for probably, which we say sometimes and other times we don't? What are the probably situations as opposed to the probably situations? And there's a subtle distinction. Come on! My point is here, with a word like well, I don't know what part of speech that is. It might be an interjection, or I think it's something like an interjection. Maybe it's an adverb. It's a little blurry what it is. But that's not my point. My point is that these words that have nothing to do with visual categories, visual objects, these are evoked by circumstances. There are well situations, and you know how to use them. And if you saw a well in an essay written by a foreigner, or in an email written by a foreigner, you would say, they don't know how to use it right, or they would put some other word in there. They should have put in well. You know where the word well goes if you're a native speaker of English, because there are well ... situations. And the same for hi, kind of, but anyway, no kidding, and so forth and so on. Compound words. Getting a little bit more complicated. Again, I'm not going to read you this list, but just giving you a sense of compound words that are typical, that we use all the time. Some of them have 2 components, some of them 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a little blurry, it doesn't matter. They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they sort of know no limit. Phrases. Let me just give you a few phrases that I happen to think of today at random. We all know these. And I'm not going to read them out loud. There but for the grace of God go I. Pretty pleased with sugar on top. I think that's a nice one. Been there, done that. I can't help but read, well, excuse me. Put your money where your mouth is. That's for sure. And these are evoked by situations. These are categories. These are categories. And I want you to understand that all these things are mental categories. And how do we judge whether the category, the situation that we're facing, is a member of this category? Guess, analogy. Proverbs. Okay, so I've listed a few proverbs, random. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I don't say that one very often, but I do say, speak of the devil all the time. Damned if I do and damned if I don't. I say that all the time. Go directly to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. I called that a proverb, but maybe it's not exactly a proverb. Maybe I miscategorized that. Maybe I made a bad analogy here. It's all Greek to me. Back to square one. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, and so forth and so on. Okay, I got some of these ideas. In fact, I was deeply influenced by an article that I read in around 1975 by Joe Becker, who's here tonight, called The Phrasal Lexicon. And Joe pointed out that what we have in our head is far, far richer than a set of words when we talk about our mental lexicon. And I can't possibly do justice to his delightful and stimulating article. I mean, very, very inspiring article. And one of his principles was that the article should apply to itself. And he took a lot of the idioms that he used throughout the article and talked about them and listed them in his lists. I've always followed that example. But proverbs, this is something that Roger Schenck pointed out. Proverbs are situation labels. We use them to, in fact, sometimes proverbs are boiled down into just a single word, like sour grapes. I know that sounds like two words, but I see it with a hyphen. Sour grapes. You know, somebody didn't get a job that they said they wanted, and then they said, "Oh, it probably wouldn't have been interesting to live in, you know, in Edmonton, Alberta, or whatever that is. It Alberta? Yeah, I wouldn't want to live in Edmonton. Sour grapes. You know, it's sort of one word. Now, I'm going to go down to the really one-word level, and I want to talk about the analogies that I had to make when I went to Italy to the, it's a research institute in Trento. I spent a year there. It was a very austere place, a very nice place, but rather austere, and there were people at many levels, bureaucrats, scientists, students, people walking the corridors. And I never quite knew who people were. They would say hello to me, and I couldn't quite figure. And so the question that I had to face, from the very beginning, was, what do you say to these people when you run into them in the corridor? And you don't even know quite who they are, or you recognize them, and you sort of know who they are, or you have spoken to them, and you know definitely who they are, you know their name, or you know them pretty well, they're kind of a friend, you've eaten lunch with them once, or you are a friend. And naively, being American, I would say ciao. That was wrong. You don't say ciao to people that you are not on familiar terms with. I mean, ciao is something that you can say to somebody that you say to, but you don't say ciao to, the director of the institute. That just doesn't work. You say buongiorno, or you say salve, and salve is sort of intermediary. And I learned this, and but I nonetheless was not a native speaker. And every time, at every moment, as I was walking down the corridors, I had to be doing these on-the-spot categorizations. Is this a ciao person, a salve person, or a buongiorno person? And sometimes I would mix them up and I would get them confused. I would blend them, but it was gradually it kind of got clearer, and I was following what I saw other people doing. I was making analogies, and not only analogies to what other people did, but analogies between people. This person is like that person to me. And so I say, okay, so if I say salve to that person, I'll say salve to this person. So words, individual words, are the locus of a fight. Every time you try to figure out what word to use, there's a subterranean fight going on, mostly hidden. And I want to just give you a little example of this. My friends Kelly and Dick were visiting my house, and they kept on referring to my office. And I kept on thinking, what does my office have to do with my house? It's over, across campus. And then I realized, of course, they were talking about my study. And so we talked about this. And I said, why do you always call it my office when I call it my study? And they said, I don't know, it sure seems like your office. And I said, it doesn't seem like my office. And it seems like my study. And my office is across campus. And so then we talked a little more. And they said, well, in our house, on our top floor, where we do our work, where we have our books and our computers, that's our office. We have a home office. That's where we do our work. And you have, on your top floor, which is not your third floor, but your second floor, you have computers, you have books, and you do your work there. And it maps perfectly. So to them it was totally obvious that this was my office. And to me it was totally obvious that it was my study, because I took my dad as my prototype. He, on the upper floor of our house up on Murata, he had a study in which he had his Frieden calculator and his books and his things. And it was just like what I did. And his office was down on campus. And so to me it was, I guess you could say, a no-brainer. And it was very interesting to see that behind both of our visions there were analogies. And it showed that word choice is guided by analogy. And I'm going to skip a couple of transparencies here. And I can see I have so many things here, I'm not going to be able to really go through them all. But I want you to see this picture which illustrates what goes on in word choice. I have not labeled the x-axis, but the x-axis in these bar graphs is sort of, it's a one-dimensional reduction of what you might call semantic space. Semantic space is a multi-dimensional space of concepts, and I've reduced it down to one dimension. I've pretended that there's just concepts along one dimension. And so here I'm facing a situation which might evoke, a word like dog. And so dog is the big winner. It's very activated, and maybe fox is a little bit activated. I don't know, I'm just making this up. And maybe cat is a little bit activated, and so forth. And so there we have it. And it's a big, dog is so, towers above the others enough that it's a big winner, and there's no visible, or audible, I should say, competition. But a lot of the time when we speak, there is audible competition. Now I want to talk about the audible competition that we hear when we are speaking. And so I'm going to talk about word blends. Here's just a few. Maybe these I will read to you, because I think they're all nice examples. I have a collection of literally hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of word blends. I just picked a few at random today, and these are ones that I just listened to. I picked them up. This was me at somebody calls on the phone. Is Danny there? That's my son. I don't know. I'll go sec. Blend of C and check. Trivial, everyday, ordinary thing. It reveals competition. It reveals subterranean competition. Okay, don't leave your car there, I say to somebody. You may get a ticket. May or might. Now this is the kind of thing nobody would hear. I mean, I pay attention to these things. It's sort of my profession, and so I do hear them. But most people just don't hear these things. Danny, my son, I love this one. I can't keep all these things in my bread at the same time. I thought that was wonderful. Brain and head. He also said, hey, wait up, I'll gum with you. That was to his sister. She was about to go to the grocery store. Hey, wait up, I'll gum with you. Gum is come and go. Just a nice blend of two different ideas. And my administrative assistant Helga said, every morning I took a Capsi ride. It's beautiful, beautiful. And the mayor of Bloomington was on the radio, and he was talking about how we have to be vigilant in putting in bike paths and other kinds of things in the town. And I thought that was a wonderful blend, because it's vigilant and it's diligent. And it also has a little bit of village in it. And this is a fascinating kind of thing. Now, I don't want you to think that blends are always that obvious. I want you to understand that blends can be extremely, extremely subtle. Here's some examples. Just two. These were in the course that I was giving last semester, called something like Analogy and Words and Concepts. And I was talking to a class, and at one point I must have made 500 errors per class session. Today who knows how many errors I've made. They're not discrete things, because they come sort of in different levels of strength. But maybe major errors today I've made 50, and maybe I've made 200, I don't know. But anyway, every day there I was making 500, and I noticed about 3, because you can't spend all your time monitoring yourself. But I did notice at one point I said, as it says here, I was having trouble finding. The F was a little too lengthy. And I said, did anybody hear that? Nobody even heard it. And I said, well, okay, but I was a little long. And you want to know why? And they, I mean, I guess they were a captive audience. So, so anyway, I said, I know there was competition in my head, and I happen to know what it was. At least part of it. I don't know the whole story, but at least I know one of the words was find, and the other was figure out. And I couldn't quite decide. Now, how much else was going on inside my head, I don't know. Inside. Okay. It was posed on the banister. It was posed on the banister. It was posed and it was poised. It was just a slightly wrong vowel. Slight distortion of the vowel. Now, you see, these kinds of things, every word that I'm saying probably has a slight error in it. And that's my point. Every word has a subterranean fight going on inside it. You don't know, you don't hear it, even I don't hear it. I'm not privy to what's going on underneath the surface. But sometimes I can feel it, and sometimes you can hear little hesitations. It may just be a hesitation before the word starts. It may be the lengthening of a consonant. It may be the distortion of a vowel. It may be a funny intonation. All of those are revelatory of the fight between words, the analogies that are struggling to take over and to beat the other ones out. Phrase blends. I hope I'm coming to an end. Phrase blends. I won't read these out loud, but I think, well, maybe these are funny. And phrase blends are not always funny. I'm not, one of these people who collect errors because it's funny and you publish it. The kids say the darndest things or whatever. That's not my reason. I think errors are wonderfully funny at times, but I don't collect them for that purpose. I collect them because I'm interested in understanding what goes on in the minds of human beings. So here's in an email. This is typed. This is not spoken. This is typed. I have it still. I hope the package got there in one shape. Okay. From a native speaker. Okay. Native speakers talking, two of them talking in a restaurant. Neither of them noticed this comment. I mean, it just went by. Nobody heard anything. He was a real easy-go-lucky guy. Easygoing and happy-go-lucky. This one I said, I should count my lucky stars. I said it on the phone, and then I said, is that right? Something. Count my lucky stars. Count my blessings, thank my lucky stars. Okay? I mean, just these kinds of things are a dime a dozen. And that was a dime a dozen situation, by the way. Categorized, I put my finger right on the essence there. This one I typed in an email when I was very tired and I wanted to hit the sack. And I said, I'm worried that my editor is going to hit the stack. And I thought that was a marvelous blend of hit the ceiling, blow his stack, and my own feeling that I wanted to hit the sack. Okay. And then my dean at one time at Indiana University was trying to lure a person to be in cognitive science, and he made this marvelous, marvelous statement that will pull no stops unturned to get him. I mean, this is amazing. All right, so I've already said this, but I just say it again because I want you to see it in writing. Every effortless category assignment is actually a seething subterranean battle of analogies. When the battle's a landslide, there's no evidence. When the battle's close, there's evidence galore. Okay, so we're coming really to the end here. Thought is the highest level of abstraction. The highest level of abstraction. Putting one's finger on the essence of a situation. And then bouncing back and forth between the actual situation and the essence that one found in one's memories, in one's memory. Now I'm going to give you an example that I think is quite charming, and it's actually something I found out about last year. I spent a long time in year 2005 working on a talk called, well, it wasn't called, but it was about Einstein's analogy making. I wanted to do something for the Annus Mirabilis 2005, the 100th anniversary, and I had the great pleasure of giving this talk in physics departments in a few places about the analogies that Einstein made, not only in 1905, but in other years. And what I was really astounded was I had never known how Einstein created the concept of, that we now know as the photon. And it was what he thought of as his most revolutionary ever idea. And I want to give you a sense of how he did it, and I can't obviously give you much of a sense of it, but let me at least just give you a slight sense. So we begin with something that was known. This is basically what's called the black body spectrum. What it basically says is if you have radiation bouncing around inside a cavity at a certain temperature, there's different amounts at different energies. And there's sort of a most amount at a certain peak energy. That's sort of the wavelength. That wavelength or that frequency is sort of the most predominant, and then there's less and less on either side of it. Longer wavelengths are less, shorter wavelengths are less. And now there was another situation. That was the situation that people didn't understand. People did understand the situation of, thanks to Maxwell and Boltzmann, of an ideal gas inside a cavity where people knew that, actually they didn't really know for sure, but they thought that the behavior of an ideal gas was due to molecules bouncing around inside, and if they assumed that it was molecules, they could make some mathematical calculations and figure out what the curve should be, and they figured out the formula for a bell-shaped curve that looked like that said that for all the different kinetic energies that you have, and you can replace kinetic energy if you don't like that word with velocity. So for all the different velocities or speeds that the molecules could have, at low speeds there weren't very many, high speeds there weren't very many, but at some intermediate speed there were a lot. And this was the distribution, and it looked kind of like that. Now, this was around for anybody to see, you have to understand, but nobody thought about it. Nobody connected these two ideas until Einstein. And Einstein said, this looks similar to me. And so I think that, maybe it's possible. This thing over here, the ideal gas, we think as being made of corpuscles, particles, molecules. And so maybe it's possible that light is also made of particles. And he did a lot of elegant mathematical calculation to check this out, and he calculated the entropy of these systems, and I won't go into any of the details. Basically, a bell-shaped curve and a bell-shaped curve, the analogy between those two, like the analogy between my two shadows, the light shadow and the snow shadow. I decided that light may be made of flakes. Einstein decided 100 years before me that light might be made out of particles. And that was what nowadays we call the light quantum hypothesis, and that was the most revolutionary discovery Einstein ever made. It came directly out of a simple connection between two bell-shaped curves, essentially. All right, well, I guess I am coming to the end, and all I need to say is on my last transparency. So, if strokes of genius are made of analogies, and personal insights, and political decisions, and dinner table conversations, and Me Too comments, which I didn't cover, unfortunately, and random remindings, and instantaneous categorization, and blends of all sorts, are all made of analogies. Might not all of cognition also be made of analogies? That's the cognition core hypothesis. Remember, you heard it first here. Thank you.
I'd like to see much more research aimed at that level. So, however, I think if we're going to try to improve things for the future, we should move some of our resources, more of our resources, into higher level theories of how the minds work and how they can be made more effective and improved. And my prediction for the 2040s is that this will happen more slowly than most of us think, but eventually it will happen.
Phase 3B, 1540.